Please, close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember a very specific scent from your childhood. Perhaps it is the earthy aroma of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney on a crisp autumn evening. Or maybe it is the unmistakable, sharp scent of fresh lemons and wild oregano being crushed between warm, hard-working hands. Welcome back to a time that feels both very far away and incredibly close to our hearts. Today, we are taking a journey back to the Greece of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We are going to remember 20 simple foods we ate when money was scarce, but our homes were overflowing with warmth. By the end of this journey, we will remember a very specific, humble piece of food that truly defines what it meant to grow up in that beautiful era. Time moved differently back then. The days felt longer, unhurried by the constant buzz of modern screens and endless notifications. Life in the neighborhoods and villages of Greece was a shared experience, played out in open courtyards, on narrow balconies, and across low fences. There is a strange myth today that because we lacked money and modern technology, our lives were somehow poorer or less fulfilling. But you and I know the profound truth. We were incredibly rich in the things that actually matter. We had the wealth of waiting, the joy of deep, uninterrupted human connection, and the immense comfort of community. When a family had extra tomatoes from the garden, they shared them. When a neighbor fired up the outdoor oven, the whole street smelled of baking bread. Our mothers and grandmothers were alchemists. They possessed the magical ability to take absolute poverty and transform it into a feast. They could look at an empty pantry and, with a little flour, some water, and a few drops of olive oil, create a meal that made us feel like royalty. Food was never just calories. It was a language of survival, of care, and of immense, unspoken love. Let us begin with the absolute king of a Greek childhood. Do you remember the simple, brilliant slice of bread with olive oil and sugar? It was the ultimate afternoon snack, the sweet treat our mothers would quickly prepare when we came home from school, or when we paused our endless games in the dusty streets. Sweets from a pastry shop were a rare luxury, reserved only for name days or major holidays, but we never felt deprived. Mother would slice a thick, uneven piece of heavy village bread, the kind with a dark, crusty outside and a dense, chewy center. She would drizzle it generously with fresh, green gold olive oil from the family's annual harvest. The oil would soak deep into the porous bread, making it wonderfully fragrant. Then, she would sprinkle a heavy layer of coarse sugar right on top. The sugar crystals would catch the afternoon sunlight, sparkling like tiny diamonds. The savory richness of the olive oil perfectly balanced the pure sweetness of the sugar, while the crunch mixed with the soft crumb. We ate it standing up, our fingers sticky and shining, before running back out to play until the street lamps flickered on. And then there was trahanas. This was not just a food. It was an entire summer ritual that prepared us for the harshness of winter. In the heat of August, the older women of the house would mix cracked wheat with soured milk or yogurt, working the dough with their strong hands. They would break it into tiny, uneven pebbles and spread them out on pristine white sheets to dry under the blazing Greek sun. The whole house smelled of fermented milk and warm grain. When winter arrived with its biting cold and the house was barely warmed by a single wood stove, Mother would boil a handful of those dried pebbles. She would add a little butter or a splash of milk, creating a thick, velvety soup. Sitting around the table, blowing on the hot spoon, we felt a deep, radiating warmth spread through our little bodies. Trahanas was the taste of foresight. It was the comforting knowledge that no matter how loud the winter wind howled outside our rattling windows, our mother had captured the heat of the summer sun in a glass jar, keeping us safe and fed. We cannot speak of those decades without honoring fasolada. The humble white bean soup was the undisputed national dish of survival. In the 1960s, eating meat was a rare event, mostly saved for Sundays if you were lucky. For the rest of the week, the large aluminum pots simmered slowly on the stove, filled with water, dried white beans, onions, carrots and celery. The secret, of course, was the generous pouring of olive oil at the very end of the boiling process, which gave the broth a rich, thick and silky texture. The smell of celery and tomato paste boiling together was the defining aroma of a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon. You would come inside from the cold, your cheeks red, and sit before a steaming bowl of fasolada. Beside it, there was always a hunk of crusty bread, a raw onion smashed with a fist to sweeten it, and perhaps a few salty black olives. You would tear the bread, dip it into the thick orange broth, and feel instantly satisfied. It was a cheap meal, yes, but it provided all the energy a hard-working father and growing children needed to face the day. Equally important in our weekly rhythm were the simple lentils, or fakes. This earthy, dark soup was the iron-rich fuel of the Greek working class. Our mothers would buy the lentils in bulk from the local grocer, bringing them home wrapped in thick brown paper. Before cooking, they would spread the small seeds on the kitchen table, carefully picking through them to remove any tiny stones. It was a quiet, meditative task. The lentils were then boiled with just garlic, an onion, a bay leaf, and tomato paste. But the true magic of this dish happened right at the table. Just before eating, we would pour a heavy splash of sharp red wine vinegar directly into our bowls. The acidic bite of the vinegar cut through the deep, earthy richness of the lentils, creating a brilliant explosion of flavor. Our mothers would always watch us eat it, reminding us that it would make us strong and put color in our cheeks. Mopping up the last drops of that vinegar-laced broth with a piece of dry bread is a flavor memory that can instantly transport you back to your childhood kitchen. Let us talk about the sweetness of petit mezi. Long before processed chocolate hazelnut spreads existed, we had this dark, magical grape molasses. The creation of petit mezi began during the autumn grape harvest. After the grapes were pressed for wine, the sweet, unfermented must was boiled down slowly in massive copper cauldrons over an open fire. It was a tedious process, requiring constant skimming and stirring, but the result was a thick, dark syrup that tasted intensely of raisins and caramel. We would spread petit mezi on a thick slice of bread for breakfast, giving us a massive rush of natural energy. But the most magical way we consumed it was during the rare times it snowed in the village. We would run outside, scoop up a bowl of fresh, clean snow, and pour the dark petit mezi directly over the icy crystals. We called it our winter ice cream. The intense, fruity sweetness of the syrup melting into the pure, freezing snow was an absolute thrill. It cost absolutely nothing, but to us children, it felt like the greatest luxury in the entire world. When summer arrived, our diet shifted to the brilliant colors of the garden. A quintessential afternoon meal was a simple slice of bread with crushed tomato and wild oregano. When money was tight and there was nothing else in the pantry, a single overripe summer tomato was enough to feed a child. Mother would take a dried barley rusk or a stale piece of bread, splash a little water on it to soften it, and then vigorously rub the cut half of a massive, sun-warmed tomato directly onto the bread. The bread would turn pink, soaking up the sweet, acidic juices and tiny yellow seeds. She would add a pinch of coarse sea salt, a drizzle of olive oil, and a generous pinch of dried mountain oregano that she had picked and dried upside down in the kitchen. The smell of that dry oregano crushing between her fingers is the exact perfume of a Greek summer. You would eat this rustic creation out on the balcony, the juices running down your chin, listening to the cicadas sing in the afternoon heat. It was simple, perfect, and tasted completely of the earth. Foraging was not a trendy hobby back then. It was an absolute necessity for survival. I am talking about horta, the wild greens of the Greek landscape. I'm sure you remember seeing your mother or grandmother walking into the hills, armed with a small plastic bag and a short curved knife. They knew exactly which green leaves were sweet, which were bitter, and which were poisonous. They would spend hours bent over the rocky soil, gathering dandelions, amaranth, and wild chicory. Bringing them home, the greens required meticulous washing in the sink to remove the stubborn soil. Then, they were boiled in heavily salted water. The cooking water turned a deep, dark green. Once tender, the steaming horta were piled high on a plate, dressed simply with the juice of a fresh lemon and a heavy pour of raw olive oil. The taste was intensely green, slightly bitter, and deeply refreshing. Eating horta connected us directly to the wild land around us. It was a meal provided entirely by God and nature. requiring no money, only the ancient knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. Do you remember the absolute joy of tiganopsomo, the poor man's fried bread? Whenever mother baked fresh bread or made a simple dough, she always saved a little piece for us children. She would stretch the scrap of dough out with her hands, sometimes crumbling a tiny piece of leftover feta cheese into the center before folding it over, though most of the time it was just plain dough. She would heat a shallow pool of olive oil in her heavy frying pan and drop the dough in. The hissing sound of the wet dough hitting the hot oil would bring us running into the kitchen. The dough would puff up immediately, turning golden brown and blistering on the edges. She would flip it once, let the other side crisp, and hand it to us wrapped in a piece of brown paper so it would not burn our fingers. The outside was incredibly crunchy, tasting of rich olive oil, while the inside was soft, steaming, and chewy. Biting into a hot tiganopsomo on a chilly afternoon was a moment of pure comfort. It was the ultimate proof that a mother's hands could turn scraps into a masterpiece. Another cornerstone of our frugal diet was revitia, the slow-cooked chickpeas. Unlike the fast-boiling lentils, chickpeas required patience and planning. They had to be soaked in water overnight, swelling quietly in a bowl on the kitchen counter. The traditional way to cook them was an event in itself. The chickpeas were placed into a large, beautiful clay pot known as a tsikali, along with onions, bay leaves, lemon, and olive oil. To keep the steam from escaping, our mothers would sometimes seal the lid of the clay pot with a ring of simple flour and water dough. Then, the pot was carried down the street to the neighborhood baker's wood-fired oven. It sat in the dying embers all night, cooking incredibly slowly. On Sunday morning, walking back from church, you would stop at the bakery to retrieve your family's pot. Breaking the baked dough seal released a cloud of fragrant, lemony steam. The chickpeas had melted into a creamy, rich stew, deeply infused with the flavor of the clay and the wood smoke. It was our Sunday roast, even when we could not afford a single piece of meat. There was also the beloved macaronia memizitra, a dish that proves how a few humble ingredients can create magic. When the cupboards were bare, pasta was the savior, but we did not have fancy meat sauces or expensive cheeses. We boiled long, thick spaghetti until it was soft. While it drained, mother would put a generous chunk of butter, or even fresh sheep's milk butter if we were lucky, into the hot, dry pot. She would let the butter melt and cook until it browned slightly, giving off a nutty, intoxicating aroma. The drained pasta was thrown back into the sizzling butter. The loud hissing sound it made was music to our hungry ears. Then came the crowning glory, a mountain of grated mizithra, a hard, dry, salty cheese made from sheep or goat milk. As the dry cheese hit the hot, buttered pasta, it started to melt just slightly, coating every strand. We would eat massive platefuls of this, our lips shining from the butter. It was incredibly filling, deeply comforting, and completely addictive. It remains a legendary comfort food for anyone who grew up in that era. When we craved a proper dessert, the answer was almost always risogalo, the classic Greek rice pudding. Milk was a precious commodity, often delivered fresh by the local shepherd or bought in glass bottles. To make it stretch and feed a whole family, our mothers turned it into risogalo. They would boil a little starchy rice in water, then add the milk, a few spoonfuls of sugar, and a piece of lemon peel or vanilla. We would stand on a chair next to the stove, watching our mother stir the pot continuously with a wooden spoon so the milk would not burn at the bottom. The smell of sweet, warm milk filled the entire house. It was poured into small glass bowls to set. The best part was watching the thin, slightly wrinkled skin form on the top of the pudding as it cooled. Just before eating it, we would dust the top with a heavy layer of dark, fragrant cinnamon. We ate it warm in the winter to soothe our throats, and cold from the icebox in the summer. Risogalo was gentle, sweet, and tasted exactly like a mother's gentle hug. Sundays in the 1970s often meant a large baking pan of gigantes, the giant baked beans. These large meaty beans were the perfect substitute for expensive cuts of beef or pork. They were boiled first, then transferred to a large, shallow metal roasting pan. Mother would smother them in a rich, homemade tomato sauce, packed with chopped onions, garlic, fresh parsley, and a touch of cinnamon or allspice. The pan went into the oven, and it stayed there until the edges of the beans began to caramelize and turn dark brown. The oil would separate from the tomato sauce, pooling beautifully at the edges of the pan. This pooling oil was the main target for our pieces of bread. Gigantes were incredibly filling, dense, and packed with flavor. Eating them at the Sunday table, perhaps with a small piece of salty feta cheese on the side, we felt completely satisfied. The rich, sweet smell of the roasting tomatoes and onions would linger in the house long into the Sunday afternoon, while the adults took their mandatory post-lunch nap. During the peak of summer, the ultimate expression of our frugal, garden-based diet was bryem. This was the traditional Greek ratatouille, born from the absolute necessity of using up whatever vegetables were growing wildly in the garden or were cheap at the street market. Zucchini, eggplant, potatoes, and onions were chopped into large, rough pieces. They were tossed directly into a baking pan with loads of crushed garlic, chopped tomatoes, and an enormous amount of olive oil. There was no meat, no fancy broth, just vegetables and oil. It was baked in the oven until the potatoes were soft enough to cut with a fork and the edges of the eggplant had turned sweet and charred. The magic of bryem was in the juices left at the bottom of the pan. The water from the zucchini and tomatoes mixed with the rich olive oil to create an incredible sauce. We would fight over who got to dip their bread into the corners of the pan. Bryem was the taste of August. It was cheap, healthy, and celebrated the natural sweetness of vegetables grown under the fierce Mediterranean sun. Perhaps the most iconic, utterly simple summer meal of all was feta cheese with cold watermelon. It sounds strange to anyone who did not grow up in Greece, but to us, it was the perfect dinner on a sweltering July evening. When the heat of the day was too oppressive to turn on the stove, Mother would carry a massive, dark green watermelon onto the balcony. She would slice it open, revealing the bright red, incredibly juicy flesh, full of large black seeds. Alongside it, she placed a block of sharp, salty, pure white feta cheese sitting in its own brine. You would take a bite of the crisp, ice-cold, sugary sweet watermelon and immediately follow it with a small bite of the pungent, crumbly cheese. The contrast was absolutely mind-blowing. The saltiness of the feta amplified the sweetness of the fruit, while the cold juice washed away the rich creaminess of the cheese. We would sit outside in the warm evening air, spitting the black seeds over the balcony railing, feeling completely refreshed. It was a meal that required zero cooking and cost pennies, yet felt like a magnificent feast. When potatoes were the only thing left in the dark cellar, Mother would make patates yachni, the classic stewed potatoes. This dish was a clever trick of the mind. By cooking humble potatoes in the exact same rich, thick tomato sauce, usually reserved for expensive beef stews, our mothers tricked our palates into feeling like we were eating a hearty meat dish. The potatoes were cut into large wedges and slowly simmered with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and tomato paste, until they were so soft they would begin to fall apart and thicken the sauce with their starch. A good amount of olive oil gave the stew a velvety finish. Served on a deep plate, the potatoes were incredibly tender, infused all the way through with the rich, savory flavors of the sauce. We would mash the potatoes slightly with our forks, letting them absorb even more of the red sauce, before scooping them up with bread. Patates yachni was a masterclass in making something out of nothing, transforming the cheapest root vegetable into a meal that felt robust and deeply satisfying on a cold day. Another staple of our childhood was the magical avgolemono broth. While today avgolemono is often associated with thick chicken soup, back then chicken was a luxury. More often than not, we ate the simple broth with rice, relying entirely on the egg and lemon for flavor and substance. Making avgolemono was a tense, theatrical moment in the kitchen. Mother would beat fresh eggs in a bowl, slowly whisking in the juice of sharp lemons. Then came the critical part. She would take a ladle of boiling broth from the pot and slowly, drop by drop, whisk it into the eggs to warm them without scrambling them. Once tempered, the golden mixture was poured back into the pot, instantly turning the clear water into a thick, cloudy, silky, lemon-scented cream. The smell was sharp, comforting, and medicinal. This was the soup we were fed when we were sick, when we were sad, or when the winter was just too cold. It coated the throat, warmed the stomach, and tasted of absolute care. The bright yellow color alone was enough to make you feel better. Let us step out of the kitchen for a moment and remember the kuluria. The simple sesame bread ring was the ultimate street food of our youth, and often our only breakfast. Walking to school in the early morning, you could hear the distinct call of the kuluras, the street vendor pushing his wooden cart or carrying a massive woven basket balanced on his head. The air around him smelled wonderfully of toasted sesame seeds and warm, slightly sweet dough. For just a few drachmas, coins that we carefully kept hidden in our pockets, we could buy a fresh kuluri. The outside was crisp, deeply coated in roasted seeds that would fall onto our school uniforms, while the inside was chewy and soft. We would hook them on our fingers, tearing off small bites as we walked with our friends. It was cheap enough that even the poorest child could usually afford one, and it provided the necessary fuel to get through the morning lessons. To this day, the smell of toasted sesame instantly brings back the sound of the school bell and the feeling of those heavy leather satchels on our backs. Back at home, the morning ritual for the adults, and occasionally for us, revolved around Greek coffee and paximadia. Paximadia are the traditional rock-hard, twice-baked barley rusks. They were created to last for months without spoiling, a true food of necessity. In the early hours, our grandparents would brew a small pot of strong, sweet Greek coffee in the copper bricky. The coffee would bubble up, creating a thick foam on top. Because the rusks were too hard to bite on their own, the ritual involved carefully dipping the paximadi directly into the hot coffee. You had to time it perfectly. If you left it in too briefly, the rusk would break your teeth. If you left it in too long, it would disintegrate and fall into the cup, ruining the coffee. When timed just right, the barley rusk softened, absorbing the dark, sweet, roasted flavor of the coffee, while retaining a slight crunch in the center. Watching our grandfathers expertly perform this dipping ritual in the quiet hours of the morning is an image permanently burnt into our memories. When summer tomatoes were abundant and the family hens were laying eggs, we dined on strapazzada, sometimes known as kagianas. This dish was fast, incredibly cheap, and phenomenally delicious. Mother would take several very ripe, soft tomatoes, the ones that were too bruised for a salad, and grate them directly into a hot frying pan with a little olive oil. The tomatoes would sizzle and break down into a thick, bubbling red sauce. The smell of frying tomatoes is deeply nostalgic. Once the water had evaporated and the sauce was thick, she would crack a few fresh eggs straight into the pan, stirring them aggressively so they scrambled into the tomato paste. Sometimes a little dry oregano or a scrap of feta was added. The result was a soft, vibrant orange, intensely flavorful scramble. We would eat it directly from the pan, sitting around the table, using torn pieces of bread instead of forks to scoop up the soft eggs. It was peasant food at its absolute finest, celebrating the peak flavors of the season with zero waste and maximum joy. Finally, we must remember the rare, magnificent treat of lucumades. While normally a street food or festival treat, mothers would occasionally make a simple version at home on a bleak winter afternoon to lift our spirits. The ingredients cost almost nothing, just flour, yeast, water, and a pinch of salt. The loose dough was left to rise near the wood stove until it was bubbling and alive. Then came the magic. Mother would heat a deep pot of oil. She would squeeze the wet dough through her left fist, scooping off a perfect little ball with a wet spoon in her right hand and dropping it into the hot oil. They would puff up instantly, bobbing in the oil and turning golden brown. Once drained, they were drenched in whatever sweet syrup was available, usually a cheap honey or just a simple sugar syrup, and heavily dusted with cinnamon. Biting into a hot lukumas, hearing the crisp shell shatter, and feeling the warm syrup flood your mouth was an experience of pure ecstasy. It was a sticky, messy, glorious celebration made from absolutely nothing. As we look back at these 20 humble foods, we realize a profound truth. We do not just miss the taste of the warm bread, the bubbling tomato sauce, or the sweet syrup. We deeply miss the people whose hands prepared them. We miss our mothers calling our names from the balcony. We miss the feeling of sitting around a small table, our knees touching, sharing a single pot of chess, feeling entirely safe and deeply loved. We miss our youth and the beautiful simplicity of a time when we had no money, but we had absolutely everything we needed. If this journey brought a tear to your eye or a warm memory to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can continue to preserve these beautiful histories together. And now, I want to ask you, which of these foods was your favorite growing up? What is the one dish your mother made that you can still smell today? Please leave a comment below and share your precious story with us. Thank you for remembering with me.